All right. And so for our first story is a story that's actually pretty long overdue for anyone to be talking about. It has pretty, I think, serious ramifications for folks that are involved in a lot of, I would say, alternative or radical politics in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so far, I haven't found any local pages reporting on it outside of its original publishing, which is, I think, is pretty significant for a story of this significance, And so, as for our own responsibility, I've been wanting to cover this story for some times, and a lot of different things got in the way, But like most Native people, we persist and we get that smoke signal out there. So let's get into it. So I had the pleasure to meet Gabriel Duncan last May. He's a really cool activist, artist, historian, and Native American steward. He's part of an organization called the Alameda Native History Project. And in their own words, they describe themselves as the Alameda Native History Project was founded in 2019 as an art project based on the history of the first Alamedans and find the tribe that belongs to this place we now call Alameda. Over the past 6 years, we focused on research, education, and advocacy for the first Alamedans and the accurate representation of local indigenous history. So they do all kinds of stuff, soil making, acorn gathering. I've had the interest to go to a couple of their workshops. We're actually going to be going to we're going to be building an acorn granary this fall. It's going to be really fun. He's a Paiute guy himself. I'm from the Mesa Grande Band, the Kumeyaay Nation. That's why I'm using these pronouns, us. So I'm just going to get into it. And so the work of the Alameda Native History Project is that their work is principally fought the erasure of Native people. Principally, it's the erasure of the Ohlone people. Often this erasure has been taken on by the federal government and by a lot of opportunists trying to appropriate indigeneity to turn a profit. And so part of that work has meant educating people about First Peoples' histories and practices. I've talked a little bit about some of the work that they've done. And with these projects, we get to learn about how First Peoples have lived with the land, how they've worked together, and think of our own modern practices. But another key part of that is sort of setting the record straight and dispelling myths and uncovering the colonial project. And so I think the Alameda History Project recently made waves, or rather sort of spread a chill through the Bay Area radical politics by publishing an article titled Krina Gould, The Myth of Lisjan and the Erosion of Tribal Sovereignty. We'll link the article in the description. And so for those who don't know, Krina Gould is the founder of the Segurate Land Trust. They claim, and she claims, to be the tribal leader of a native nation called the Confederated Bands of Lisjan. And, they claim to be a nation of native people. And the piece that the Alameda Native History put out is very important because it tries to set the record straight about who are the first people of the Bay Area. And they directly criticize this idea of Lisjan as an identity. They really basically call this out as, this isn't a native nation. This is a nonprofit. It's an NGO. But what do they mean by that when they say that? Well, I think we got to ask, who are the first people of the Bay Area? Who are the Native Americans here, right? And so if you're you're from this area or you're familiar with the politics, you might be able to say, the Ohlone. The Ohlone are the first people who of the Bay Area. But that's kind of like saying, who lives in Oakland? Oaklanders. It's not very specifically. Mm-hmm. But specifically, when we say the first people of the Bay Area, we're referring to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. Right, and so this is not the Segurate Land Trust. This isn't anything this is totally separate from this so-called Confederated Bands of Lisjan. And more importantly, this article puts forward the claim is that opportunists like the Segurate Land Trust have been trying to erase the Muwekma and profit off Native representation in their place as an act of fraud, really. And so this piece details how the Segurate Land Trust misrepresents themselves to the public and profit off exploiting Native politics. The Segurate Land Trust and Krina Gould claim to represent a Native nation of Ohlone people. And that's not true. They are a nonprofit. They are not a legal institute. They're not, they're not a community of people. They're not a trust, right, that carries on in perpetuity, right? They're a business, one type of business model, one type of tax unit, right? And so, this, I think it's important. This is important to talk about because when we talk about the erasure of the Muwekma, when we say the modern colonization and erasure of Native people, this is like the product of that because this is something that only Native people in this society have to deal with, right? Like Korean people don't have to deal with a group of Korean people pretending to have like a political party that represents people in South Korea that doesn't exist, right? Like they don't have to do that, right? Because South Koreans have an independent society that has political power that can represent them, right? But often for indigenous people, Native American people, we lack that political sovereignty, right? There's no political, cultural, economic, social, political pole that can actually set the record straight, right? So when somebody claims to represent a Native nation, well, there's no parallel authority that can actually contradict that. And so I think, I just really wanted to read this one section about like why, this stuff matters, why like it actually matters, like, who's a nation and who's not. What's the difference between these two things? And so, from their own articles, they say that the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area is the only tribal government with documented continuity, legal standing, and ancestral responsibility for this land. The Muwekma are the living successors of the historic, federally recognized Verona Band of Alameda County. They descend from the indigenous people forced into the Mission San Jose de Guadalupe, Santa Clara de Tamian, and the San Francisco de Asís. And today, Muwekma has over 600 enrolled members. They have fought for their sovereignty, defended their sacred sites, and preserved their genealogy and governance through every wave of erasure, missions, courts, colonization, and nonprofits. And this is an important thing, it's for folks that I think important context. The Muwekma band, they used to be federally recognized in the first hand of the 20th century, but that federal recognition was removed from them, I think, in the mid 1920s. What does that mean? It means that the federal government really is just trying to get rid of them, right? They're trying to get rid of them as an independent political entity, right? Because when they give them federal recognition, what they actually do is they also claim these people are they're entitled to certain things, right? They're entitled to a certain level of political and economic respect, right? Or there's certain obligations that the federal government has to them, right? And so they've been dealing with all different types of erasure. And so this particular episode right now is happening now is just one phase of a series of different attacks on them. But this isn't to say that people like Karina Gould are not Ohlone people, right? This isn't anything like that. This isn't to say that the Segura Te Land Trust doesn't have its own basis in any ideas that were common to the Ohlone people. No, it's not to say at all. She definitely is. But this organization is intentionally separate from any tribal government that represents Native people politically. And so the Segura Te Land Trust, rather than representing a Native nation, represents a group of activists and individuals that may be partially Native, but it's still a liberal nonprofit. And this matters. It matters when people are rematriating land and money and resources to a liberal nonprofit versus a Native nation. Those are very different things. So I think the interesting thing, like I think, is the city of Berkeley is like they've given land to the Segura Te Land Trust under the idea of rematriating it back to Native peoples, but they're just donating it to a liberal nonprofit as a tax write-off. And then what happens when this NGO goes default, doesn't file its taxes correctly? Then some speculator buys it. Okay, then the rematriated land has been unmatriated back to the white man. It's ridiculous, right? So these things actually matter. It's not just an issue of just like left-wing infighting, And so, the Segura Te Land Trust, they solicit money, resource, and political support under the banner of supporting indigenous nations, but they erase the struggles of actual Native nations in the Bay Area. The Muwekma are trying to assert their land stewardship rights over areas like the Presidio in San Francisco right now. And they need a lot of support right now. But the mainstream activist milieu is under the impression that they don't even exist. And they should just donate money to some liberal nonprofit. It's a fucking criminal. So check out the piece, learn more about Native people, and don't just throw money and support at some brown person. Look into what you're supporting. This is being done under the idea of strengthening our movement, but that requires accountability. Don't defraud people. Don't erase Native peoples. Don't be greedy, and then you have nothing to hide from people. It's fine. But anyway, Dale, what are some of your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, you covered a lot of really important points with that, and I do want to say first off, it is pretty sad that there isn't more coverage on this particular subject, honestly, because I do think this is like a really important piece that came out and exposure. But people just aren't really talking about it. It kind of seems like it's gotten past that initial wave of the Segura Te Land Trust getting a lot of criticism to the point where they would have to lock their Instagram posts, and now people are like back to business as usual or whatever, which is pretty sad. I will say, like, as somebody who started getting into more like left progressive activist spaces about like 8 years ago. This was my like first introduction to like, okay, what is like the indigenous movement like locally? And you would see a lot of people posting about this stuff. They would talk about saving the Shell Mound, in the East Bay. Shell Mound specifically was like a burial site that the Ohlone people would have, where they would, it would be like a combination of like, the carapaces of like shellfish, and then also like, people from their band or whatnot. And let's be frank, these sites were desecrated. At one period of time, like some of the, quote unquote artifacts from those were just like displayed in the Emeryville Mall bathrooms. It's some pretty messed up stuff. But I
And
think,
remember, the campaign to save the shell mounds, they're a parking lot.
yeah,
Right? The shell mounds are a parking lot.
yeah, it was just they were gonna take over a parking lot. But me not knowing a whole lot, I was like, oh yeah, this is important. But a big thing that this particular campaign and a lot of what they run on is, a lot of like white liberal guilt. And I do think it's important to be skeptical of political campaigns that are purely driven by guilt. People should understand it's like in their interest, not that they feel bad that something's happening. I mean, yeah, you should probably feel bad if some shit's happening, but it should go deeper than that. You should realize like, oh, it's more than me just feeling bad. I realize this affects me too. And like I think a big part of it is like, they operate pretty heavily. Looks like Fred's making a cameo. They operate pretty heavily on, what they call this Shumi land tax, where essentially they solicit like regular donations. They have like a whole recommendation based on people's like tax bracket income, basically claiming like, yeah, like if you're a white person or a non-native person, like you should give us money. But it's like, this nonprofit is completely independent of the actual indigenous tribal band of the area that has this historical legacy, and it's a completely different thing if a band or a group or a community decides to make something like that. And it's a really difficult process, that people have to go through for self-determination. I even think like one point that's important to recognize is like even like self-determination as we see it in the United States for indigenous folks, it's an inherently flawed system because it exists in this place where, it exists in this place where, the system that created that position, still exists, but it's still an improvement on what already exists, which is the complete erasure of, history and culture and just people in general. But yeah, I think it's important for people to, learn more about this stuff, understand what's really happening. And, I definitely think it's great that you're trying to get more involved with the Muwekma band and whatnot. And I think that's what more people should do as opposed to like, just looking for another nonprofit to support that they can write as a tax write-off at their end of the year when they're doing their taxes or whatnot. Because I think it's like, these are fundamentally different, organizations that are created. One's that's done from a community of people, and the other that's done by a couple of individuals who are benefiting off of it financially, and in a number of other ways. So I don't know.